This is Doug DeMuro, and today I am going to tell you about the 5 worst cars that I have ever owned. The 5 worst. I have owned, up until this moment, 37 different automobiles. Some have been great, some have been terrible. So let's go through my 5 worst cars. Before we get started, are you ready for your next cool car? Sell your enthusiast car on Cars and Bids. Trading in your car to dealers means you aren't getting market value for your car, leaving you with less cash for your next fun car. Just look at our recent sales of these cool cars compared to current trade-in value. This is a trade-in offer, and this was the Cars and Bids result. This is a trade-in offer, and this was the Cars and Bids result. This is the trade-in offer, and this is the Cars and Bids result. Get started now on carsandbids.com. Sell on Cars and Bids and join the best community to sell your enthusiast car. Okay, so my 5 worst cars. I got my very first car when I was in high school. It was a 1996 Volvo 850. We bought it for $6,000, and that was in 2004. So I have now had cars for 22 years, and I've had 37 different cars, and some of them have been terrible. So I'm going to actually rank the 5 worst cars that I've ever owned, starting with number 5 and going down to number 1, my worst car of all time. So we begin with number 5. 5th worst car I ever owned was a recent one, actually, that you will know well from my channel. It was my 1998 Mercedes-Benz A140, my A-Class. So the genesis of this car, the story of this car, is that I always thought that some of the late 90s, early 2000s European, like compact MPV type cars were cool. The Mercedes A-Class, which came out in 98, and the Audi A2 and the Fiat Multipla were always kind of my favorite ones. And at that time in the car world, Europe was taking far more risks in terms of design than what we could get in the States. And I remember as a kid, my family only ever took one trip overseas when I was growing up. And it was, we went to London and Paris in 99 when I was 11. And it was a huge deal for my family to do this kind of a trip. And I remember though, that was like the peak. I was 11 and a half, whatever. It was like the peak of my really into cars and nothing else. So we went to like the Tower Bridge in London and the Tower of London and all this, Trafalgar Square, and I'm just looking at cars, right? So the thing that was the most impressive to me when I was there as a kid, that left the most impression, was those types of vehicles. The Ford Ka had just come out, and there were just these weird cars in Europe that we didn't get in the States. The reason for all these weird cars was that Europe had so many different manufacturers of cars, and the segments were really small. There was like subcompact, compact, slightly larger than compact, super mini, like all these little cars. And in order to distinguish them from one another, some automakers took risks and tried to get people on style. They were otherwise pretty similar cars. It's sort of like today in the States with compact crossovers. So some of them were weird. And so the A-Class left a huge impression on me when I was a kid. All of those did. And when I got some money and was like, I want to do something weird, the A-Class was the weird car that I chose, mostly because it was the first one that became legal to import to the US. A car essentially has to be 25 years old in order to be easily imported to the United States. The A-Class was 25 first, so I bought one in 23 when it turned 25. I hated it. Absolutely hated it. And one of the things that this taught me, my friends actually think this is one of the worst things that's ever happened to me, because one of the things this taught me is just because you like how a car looks and the idea of a car does not mean that you actually need to buy and own and use the car. And so my experience with the A-Class has actually really put me off of buying a lot of other cars that I would otherwise have been like having fun with and screwing around with. And my friends hate it because it's given them less of an opportunity to be around some interesting cars that I would have owned. But I still want a Multipla, yeah, but I know it's not going to, like, the A-Class was a bad driving experience. It was slow, it was wafty, the transmission felt like shifting butter, like it just wasn't a very good car in any respect. And so ultimately it just wasn't an experience that I would like to repeat. It was fun to have it. It was fun that it looked cool. I loved driving it and then walking out of it and looking at it later like, what is this alien creature? I still think it is a very clever looking car and very interesting. Europeans have gotten so used to the A-Class, I think they don't really realize just how unusual and striking it is, and probably was when it first came out back then. But I still think it's a cool looking car. But one of the things I learned from that experience is that style alone is is not enough to justify like purchasing a car and owning it. I'm now in a phase where I want to have my cars for longer, do more with them, really enjoy the experience, have them be a part of my life. And a car that looks cool but doesn't drive well correspondingly is just not enough for me. So that was the number 5 worst car I ever owned. I sold that car to a guy in Texas on Cars and Bids. He drove it from California to Texas, which is crazy. The only long distance American road trip in history in an A-class. But it was a cool car, and I definitely do not miss it. And it definitely has informed some of my future decisions about not getting cars like that. Okay. Next up, the number 4 worst car I ever had was a 2001 Toyota Prius. Yes, I owned a first generation Prius. Although technically the first gen Prius was sold in Japan, the one we got in the States initially was actually sort of a Gen 1.5 Prius, maybe a Gen 2 if you want to call it that. But I owned the original Prius sold in the US. The genesis of this, I've never really talked about this car before, but the genesis of this was a friend of mine was moving to New York City. I was living in Atlanta, and he had the Prius. He didn't care about cars, but he wanted something efficient, so he bought this Prius, and he was moving to New York, and he didn't need a car anymore. And so I lowballed the hell out of him, and he just needed it gone and needed to move on with his life, and so he sold it to me for nothing. And I only had the car for maybe 6 months before I decided I didn't really need a first-gen Prius, and I sold it on Craigslist to a guy in Nashville. And I think that person still has the car. Based on Carfax, this was probably 12 years ago, and I think that person still has the car. It was that darker forest green color. This was long before I was ever doing YouTube, so there's no content about this car. But I had a first-gen Prius, and it was enough for me to understand that the first-gen Prius is a pretty ridiculous car, and I would still love to do a video on one at some point. But it wasn't great. Like, as an enthusiast, of course this car appears on my 5 worst cars list because it was just dynamically awful. It was slow, it didn't handle well, etc. I always found the first-gen Prius to be pretty attractive looking, though, and the interior was surprisingly cleverly packaged, so it had good space considering that it was a small car. It was a nice car that I would have at that time and still would recommend to certain people, but not car enthusiasts, and so it certainly wouldn't be on my list of great cars. In fact, it's on my list of the worst cars. Okay, on the subject of worst cars I've ever owned, the number 3 worst car I've ever owned, I had a 2009 Nissan Cube. You may remember this car. It was a hatchback, but it was insane looking. I own a Nissan Cube. And in fact, I actually did some content on it at the very beginning of my YouTube career. If you watch my very first YouTube video in 2013, 12 years ago, when I did my Cadillac CTS V wagon review, that was my first video. My Nissan Cube had a small role in that video. And then later I actually did a full video about my Nissan Cube before I sold it. And I sold it on Craigslist. This was ages and ages ago to somebody, and they bought it and drove it for a while and then crashed it and totaled it. Why did I have a Nissan Cube? When my brother graduated from college, he bought a Nissan Cube, which was a pretty reasonable car for someone coming out of college. It was economical, it was big, he wanted to start a business and he thought he might be transporting a bunch of stuff. He had a dog, the dog frequently would jump in the car. In fact, that car smelled like dog for many years. In the end, my brother, after a few years, decided he didn't want a Nissan Cube anymore, and he bought an Xterra, which he actually still owns. He's had his Xterra for 13 years. But the Cube, I was like, hey man, I'll buy it. I was always kind of looking for a reliable second car, especially in that era. I had a lot of unreliable cars myself. I had an old Range Rover Classic and all this stuff that was breaking down or causing problems. And so having one economical, reliable car was a pretty good option. And so I said, I'll buy it from him. So I did. I bought it from him for, not that much. They were worth, even then, maybe $6 or $8 grand. And I drove around in it for a while. And I used it when I needed certain things. As an example, a buddy of mine was redoing his yard, and he didn't have a pickup, and I was like, why don't you take the Cube? So for 3 weeks he took the Cube and just put mulch and stuff in the back of it, and it's no problem. And when I lived in Atlanta where I had the Cube, I used to have to go and pick up press cars at Auto Trader where I worked, and so I would drive the Cube to Auto Trader, I would leave the Cube there, pick up the press car, drive it home. It was a good system. So I had purposes for it. My favorite thing I did with the Cube, though, is it was an extra car, and so I would occasionally change the license plate to get a cool license plate. And at one point, I remember I went into the DMV in Atlanta downtown, and I convinced them to issue me the license plate 001AAA. And at the time, Georgia plates had 3 numbers followed by 3 letters, or they had just gone away from that. And so it looked like it was the very first license plate. Now, the trick was that Georgia plates never started with 0. The very first plate in every sequence in Georgia at that time was 100. So the first plate would have actually been 100 AAA. But they let me personalize it like this, and so it looked like 001 AAA. And occasionally people would come up to me and be like, "Oh my God, you have the first license plate." And I'd be like, "Yup. That's me, number 1. But anyway, that was my cube. Obviously, from a driving perspective, it wasn't particularly good. Tall interior, bad dynamics, slow, etc. It was a bad car that I don't regret owning it, but I'm listing the worst cars I ever owned, and it definitely was one of the worst cars I owned. It just, for the purpose of having like a second, or sometimes it was a third car, to just like be a reliable, useful, economical car that if it was raining or if I needed to transport a pet or whatever, it was nice to have. It was bad. It sucked, but it's always nice to have a cheap, reliable car like that you don't care about for those purposes. Okay, next car. Down to the top 2 worst cars I ever owned. Number 2, easily, my 1995 AM General Hummer. I did a lot of content around my Hummer in 2015, 10 years ago. And at the time that I bought my Hummer, I was doing videos where I would have the audience select my car. I would do a big thing where I'd say, "Hey, select the next Doug car. The audience gets to choose, and then I will buy whatever you suggest." And in 2015, I was sort of split between an R32 Skyline GTR and a Hummer, and I bought both. And the Hummer was absolutely horrible. Now, I want to say something. I don't view all AM General Hummers to be horrible. I actually think the Hummer, or the H1 as it's now become called, is a pretty damn cool car. I really think it's pretty cool. But personally, the one I had kind of sucked. It was an early civilian model, so it didn't have a lot of the nice luxury stuff that came in later ones. And it also had a gas 5.7 liter Chevy V8. When I bought my Hummer, I didn't know that much about servicing, repairing, working on cars. And all I remember reading on the Hummer forums is that the naturally aspirated diesel engine that the early Hummers came with had a casting flaw, and one of the cylinders had been cast incorrectly, and the engine would crack and the block would have to be replaced. And as a 25-year-old, like I was with not much money, who was buying cars to make content, I was absolutely horrified of this potential outcome. And so I figured if I found a gas V8 Hummer, which they did make. They made gas and diesels for a while before they switched entirely to diesels. If I found a gas V8, it was a regular old Chevy V8. It would be reliable, it would be easy, and it would be serviceable. And that was true. I owned that car for about a year, and it stranded me once, but the problem was very small. I took it to a Chevy dealer. They fixed it for like $300. It was like nothing. And it was a reliable car, but the problem was that gas V8 was radically overmatched by what the Hummer was. And so it just wasn't a very good car. And my Hummer was also not that great. Like, it had been painted like with a roller. Like, it wasn't shiny. It didn't look that great. It was just not a very good car. I bought it cheap though for a Hummer, and I sold it cheap. I didn't really lose much money in it. And I was happy to get rid of it when it was gone. It was cool. It was a cool car, but in retrospect, I bought the wrong one, but it was what my budget had. But it was just absolutely really not a great example of a Hummer with not the best engine. In fact, probably the worst engine. And it just didn't drive well. It was loud. It was difficult. It was wide. I also lived at the time in Center City, Philadelphia, which is a very compact, crowded city. It was not the place to have a Hummer. Everything about it was just not correct. In years past, I've actually reconsidered buying another one, just because I know I did it wrong, and I would kind of like to have a good one, like an H1 Alpha with the Duramax, or an earlier one with the swap Duramax. I think would be a pretty cool car, but I've never done it. One of my problems with the Hummer was then and still is, it's not a very well packaged car. It only has 4 seats. The rear seats are really small, and so despite the car's massive size, because they wanted to pull all of the underside stuff up into the cabin to get the most possible ground clearance, it really forced the passengers to these little tiny outboard seats, and it just is not a particularly practical car. And I've never seriously pursued getting another one, but mine was a really, really bad experience. And finally, the #1 worst car I've ever owned, and I'm sorry because this is going to be a little anticlimactic. You probably don't even know I've owned this car. A 2001 Ford Explorer Sport. The Ford Explorer Sport was the two-door Ford Explorer, and the very first two generations of the Explorer Sport were basically equivalent to the four-door. But the third generation Explorer Sport was like different than the third generation Explorer, and it was much worse. And it was just a bad car. 4-liter V6, 200 horsepower. Again, this was a car that I had inherited from my brother. When he bought the Cube, he was getting out of his Explorer Sport, and I bought that off him. I bought two of my brother's cars right in a row. I'm not getting his Xterra. But anyway, so the Explorer Sport, it was just not good. It was a four-wheel drive car. We had bought it in Colorado where I lived, but I owned it in Georgia where I had moved, and it was just bad. Fords from that era, except the Ford GT, Fords from that era were just so bad. The squeaky suspension and the bad interiors, none of the panels matched. They would put plastic next to plastic and it would be different colors, like slightly off, but enough that it would irk you. The column shifter, and you could feel the car lurch into gear. The third generation Ford Explorer Sport was a bad car, but it was what my brother had, and it was my first attempt at doing what I mentioned a little bit ago, which was buying a reliable extra car that I could use when I didn't want to put miles on a sports car or when it was raining or whatever. And I used the Explorer Sport for that purpose for about a year, maybe 6 months, before I was like, this is just too awful. I simply cannot continue this. And so I didn't, and that car went away, and that was the end. It really is impressive how dynamically bad those Explorer Sports were. They were just, they made a lot of noise when they accelerated, but they did not go fast. The suspension was always squeaking. It must have been from the factory. And every time I see one now, it's just like squeaking along, just worn and awful. The steering was terrible. Believe it or not, my family actually had a second-gen Explorer Sport also, a 96 model. That was my brother's first car. And that's why he got the 01. The original one he had was okay. He got a newer one, but it was just, from a car enthusiast perspective, it was just such a bad car. And I sold that car to someone who eventually totaled it in Georgia. And so thankfully, it is off the road. It doesn't have to hurt us anymore.